Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to share time with you in this space and to be able to exchange ideas about culture, inclusion, belonging, and disability, and the idea that we have been able to have a space where we look at ourselves, we look at our colleagues, we look at our different cultural communities. I hope will provide you with new and different ideas about DEIA in your individual spaces, in your classrooms, and in your organizations. My name is Kelly Nye-Lengerman, and I work for the University of Maryland. And I'm excited to be here to share with you today some of the lessons that I've learned on the journey that I've had as a social worker. And so I bring a slightly different perspective today. Oh, you're trying to fix it. Okay, I was pushing the button. There we go. So, as I said, my name is Kelly, and I am so excited to be here. This is actually my second trip to Taiwan. I visited in 2023 with some lovely colleagues from the Maria Social Welfare Foundation regarding community living for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that is part of my background and my specialty. So I am trained as a social worker, which has given me, I think, a different perspective on thinking about DEIA and inclusion in the workplace and the workforce, but also a unique one that adds to sort of the dimension that we're sharing here today. So my background is in disability policy and services, and one of the things that really propelled me in my career was that as I was working as a case manager and a social worker with individuals and families, what I really discovered was that people had all of these untapped talents, these gifts, these skills, these ideas about things. And when I was supporting young people to transition from high school into careers, there were so many actually employers that were really interested and engaged in working and supporting them as successful employees. But the systems that we have in the United States didn't always facilitate that easy transition. And so what I bumped up against was this idea that you have all of these talented, interesting, exciting people, and you have sort of systems that are getting in their way. And for me, what that did to me as a young person is it made me mad, and it made me very frustrated to say, I want to be about changing those systems. So how do we build better policies that work for disabled people? And how do we build better systems that work for everybody? And whether that's in our employers, whether that's in our schools, and whether that's in our public policy. So that's really what brings me here today. And the other dimension that I'll share that has really deeply informed how I think about the work that we're doing and the conversations that we're having is that early in my career as a social worker, I worked in systems that both were really promoting inclusion, where disabled people were living and working in the community looking the same as everyone else. And I also worked in a number of settings that we would consider segregated or sheltered work or facility-based employment, where people had different kinds of choices in a different environment. And those two environments produced sort of very different ideas about belonging and inclusion that have really deeply informed how I think about the work today. The next slide, I think, is sort of an interesting one. I didn't think much about it. If you go to academic conferences, this is my disclaimer that the comments that I'm going to share with you today are based on my own experience and not based on my employer or the people that have funded my research. But I was thinking about Dr. Kwan's psychological safety comment about how do we create psychological safety where people can feel free to share their ideas, their values, their commitments publicly without sort of fear, shame of retribution. And it's interesting that in sort of the academic world, we often put these disclaimers on our work for that very reason. So I guess that means maybe it doesn't always feel psychologically safe to share ideas about certain things. So thank you, Dr. Kwan, for bringing that point up and letting me hit that home. So when we talk about inclusion in the workplace, we are really also talking about untapped potential. We have heard from a number of employers, and I think all you have to do is read the news to see that there are workforce shortages everywhere, in all kinds of industries, in all kinds of professions. And it's been rather curious, I think, for those of us who have worked in inclusive employment for a long time to be like, oh my gosh, we have a solution. There are millions of disabled people who are ready, willing, able to work and add value to our industries, to our businesses, to our organizations. And so it feels like a very unique time to sort of say, as we're having these workforce shortages and this crisis in all sorts of industries, that there is this opportunity to sort of make a match, to say, here is a problem, we offer a solution. The reality is this solution has been here all of the time. It's just now that I think more in the modern era in the last 10 years, we've been more willing and open to the ideas of DEIA in the workplace. And one of the reasons that I think particular Dr. Kwan and I's sessions kind of meld nicely together is my comments and reflections today with you are really about digging into your personal self and the impact that you have as an individual. And it really starts with this attitude of expectation. And I know oftentimes we go about our jobs and work for our employers, and we don't always go through those things with really intentional thinking about the why we do the things that we do. And I want us to take the opportunity today to sort of step back and look inward, particularly because there are so many young and early career professionals here today, both from universities and organizations that are with us. And so recognizing both the power and the responsibility that you have as an HR professional or as an executive or an individual who plays the leadership role in your company, that you truly can lead by example. But sometimes what we found, or what I've also found, is that we don't understand why we do the things that we do. And so my central premise today is finding out and starting with the why of inclusion in the workplace. So for those of you that might be familiar with some modern media in the US, there's a gentleman named Simon Sinek, and he did a TED Talk many, many years ago about leadership. And the core tenets of his speech or his TED Talk were about we as leaders and organizations need to find out what is in our heart, what is our why for our business. And I've thought about that for many years as I've worked with employers and organizations and universities around inclusion is that many of us haven't necessarily always taken the time to go back and think about what is the why that brings us to the work. And in the work that I've done with employers and businesses, sometimes they come at it from all different angles, but really helping sort of focus the energy and the attention on understanding is, why do we choose inclusive hiring? Why do we choose inclusive practices? Why is DEIA the right thing for our organization? But in addition to sort of being able to reflect individually about what brings you to this work and what are your motivations for prioritizing DEIA in your roles and in your job, is that in addition to that, understanding the why of our organizations can be incredibly powerful fuel to help us understand what we need to take on next in our organizations. And so understanding this why really helps us build that business case for inclusive hiring. Now, you can imagine, and we've met many different organizations that have been here with us today, we're going to meet a few more later on, is that different organizations also come to DEIA in different ways. And what I really want to both challenge and present to you today is that there are different cases for inclusive hiring and practices. And regardless of sort of how you get there, is maybe not the most important thing, but understanding and reflecting why you got there and how your why drives some of the behavior and the choices that you might engage in as an HR professional. So I have to remember to keep clicking both slides here. So I have three primary examples that I'm going to go through in thinking about what is the why, what is that core that sort of pushes us to make the decisions that we make as organizations and businesses. I think one of the other really important things that as I give you a few examples and we dig into these is that regardless of how people come to sort of their DEIA and inclusive hiring and practices journey is maybe not the most salient point overall. I think we might have some individual values of saying, well, this case or this action is more important than another. But the reality is regardless of how people get to inclusive recruitment and hiring, the fact that you're here, that is the most important thing. And so for starters, thinking about the social case of sort of what is the ethical imperative that we find ourselves facing today. And I don't think it's any secret, because if you look at different numbers, both from things from the World Health Organization or things in your individual nations, is that disability is everywhere. We don't necessarily always see it, but it is everywhere. And being that disability is really a natural part of the human experience, it's not surprising that over 1 billion people in the world are living with some form of disability. And so really when we think about our businesses and our organizations, we need to recognize, and many organizations are driven by a why to say, this is what's right for us, because disability is part of the fabric and the culture and the community of all of our organizations, of all of our countries. And so recognizing to be able to say, we want to change attitudes and expectations, because if we don't, we could be left behind. We could be missing important talent. We could be having employees that leave organizations or leave our companies because we haven't made ourselves inclusive, accommodating, flexible in the ways that they need to. Another important dimension of thinking about that social case for inclusion is creating psychological safety, which Dr. Kwan spoke about earlier, is that when we sort of come at it and come at inclusion from a social imperative or a social and ethical imperative, we also are striving to create that psychological and social safety. And so if your organization is one of those that says, we can't really afford not to, like as human beings, as fellow colleagues, we need to lean into this idea of inclusion in the workplace, sort of under the auspices of an ethical and talent imperative. An example that I want to share with you with this, and I'll have an example of each different type as I go along on the journey today, is an organization called Auticon. And I believe they were actually acquired within the last year or two. So originally they were a Canadian company. But when I met them many years ago, it was a fascinating example of this sort of social and ethical imperative to include individuals with autism in the workplace. And they are an organization that focuses on IT and doing all sorts of IT, from front end to back end, developer activities. And I'm not an IT or a developer, so I'm not using exactly the right words of all of the different types of science and technology that they use. But they built an inclusive organization around the talents of autistic individuals. And they really focused their work on the strengths, the interests, the priorities, and the values of autistic individuals. And along that journey, they picked up lots of other people on the way. And so they recognized as a business to say, some of our best talent, our best thinking, our best opportunity is coming from individuals who happen to have autism, but that's actually not the most interesting thing about them. They bring an incredible value to our business in other ways. And so I encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to go online and look at their website. They have a pretty dynamic CEO. His name is Garrett. And again, he talks and he gets a lot of attention about their organization because they have so many autistic IT specialists and IT talent. But again, his company does so many other things than that. But they've really become sort of a pioneer in thinking about that social case for inclusion within the workplace. Another example that I want to share with you is, if you're from the United States, you've probably heard of Rocket or Rocket Mortgage. It's a mortgage firm, and they have a number of different subsidiaries and business spin-offs. But one of the other fascinating things about this organization is that one of their accessibility designers came up with this empathy generator, which I found absolutely fascinating in thinking about how do they as an organization build tools both for within a large company, but also tools for their customers. And so the idea of the empathy generator is really this mixed sort of virtual reality accessibility tool that allows them to look at different parts of their website, different parts of their products, different parts of their services, and tries to shift perspectives. And so again, thinking about making that sort of social case for inclusion in the workplace, building and using tools like that is a great example of saying they recognize the talent and the needs of disabled individuals, disabled workers, and disabled customers, and how do they turn it into something that makes good business sense and drives their why as an organization. So I really encourage you to check out the Empathy Generator. There hasn't been a lot of published literature about it. It's not something that you can necessarily go online and try it out, but it's certainly something that I find sort of unique and interesting in trying to shift perspectives around inclusion in products and services. So let's talk about the economic case. We heard a lot about that yesterday from a number of the speakers, that having a diversified workforce, having a workforce that includes disabled workers, makes good business sense for a million different reasons, regardless of the industry that you work in. And so we recognize that, or at least I hope many of us recognize in the room here today, that having a diverse workforce that includes all kinds of people with all kinds of talents and all kinds of backgrounds makes us more resilient and nimble as businesses, regardless of the industry that you work in. And that there really are and can be significant tangible financial benefits to diverse workforces that include disabled workers. And there are all of these side benefits. And so many organizations come at their case for inclusion in the workplace using this economic case or this business imperative narrative, saying that our disability advantage can really improve our communication. It increases our innovation because people are thinking about and approaching the work in different ways. There are many different low-cost accommodations and ways that we can universally design our space that benefit all different types of employees. And last but not least, it improves our customer engagement and it improves our employee retention and satisfaction in the workplace. And so it's really about unlocking that value. So I've met and worked with many organizations that really lean in to inclusive practices and inclusive hiring because it just makes good business sense. So slightly different than sort of that social case, this case is more thinking about some of the other fiscal or public benefits around choosing inclusion. So one of the examples that I have to share this is Walgreens in the United States is a very large retail drugstore chain, and they sell many different types of products and services, and Walgreens, similar to Rocket Mortgage, has all sorts of sort of company spin-offs. And if you spend a lot of time or you read it all about Walgreens as an organization, they've engaged in sort of an inclusive redesign across many parts of their business. So whether it is in their factories and distribution centers that are shipping products all over the United States and other parts of the world, whether it's packaging, whether it's working with customers in stores, they really underwent a transformation over the last 15 to 20 years to basically say our business is better, our business is stronger because we've redesigned the way we think about work and the way that we think about many of the jobs and roles in our company, because it makes economic sense for us to have a diversified workforce that absolutely wraps people with disabilities in and around all of the things that they do. Now, I do believe one of their senior executives also has a family member, a child with a disability that was also a big motivating factor for them to undergo their rethinking and transformation. However, if you look at many of their materials, if you look at their website online, you can really see that they have tried to fold in all of these components of the economic value of disabled workers, and that at the end of the day, it's made them a stronger and more resilient company, and in some cases, in this case, they've won awards for the level of inclusion and participation they have. So a couple things that I'll call out there that you can also read about on their website as well is they have these sort of supply chain groups as well as these retail training programs also for disabled workers. And so again, I think if you as an organization are thinking about your why, one of your whys for DEIA in the workplaces is this is going to advance our company and our organization in powerful economic ways, beyond the social benefits. Another example that I have here is a company called Soapy Joe's. And I thought a little bit about it yesterday when we were talking about the Sunshine gas stations. And in Southern California, there's a large chain of car washes called Soapy Joe's. And one of the really fun and interesting stories that has certainly got a lot of attention and they've shared is that they hire a lot of workers with disabilities. And what they often talk about and what they have sort of shared with myself and my other research team is that often the workers that they hire that happen to have disabilities are some of their best, most effective workers in all of the company. And so while they have hundreds of car washes around Southern California, some of their best salespeople, in the top 3 salespeople is a gentleman who happens to have an intellectual disability. So it's an interesting and unique example. It shouldn't necessarily be surprising, but because he happens to have an intellectual disability, that makes it even more interesting to some people, is that he's sold more memberships for car washers than almost anyone else in the entire organization. And that they really reflect back is that hiring disabled workers in their company has increased their employer retention, and that their HR staff have really said that many of the partnerships that we have with disabled workers and in our employment relationship has been the most economically effective as a company. And so again, this is another example to say Soapy Joe's thinks about and has approached the inclusion imperative or the inclusion journey from that economic case. One of the other cases that I want to share, and I think it's really important because it has come up, and Suzanne talked a little bit about it yesterday too, we have rules in the United States, and we've had priorities, and other countries do as well, that we learned about, is that there are some legal rules around hiring and discrimination and goals around hiring, and those are really important, and those policy foundations provide us a place as organizations and as countries from which to build. However, some companies and organizations choose to use their why from sort of a legal perspective to say, we are going to lean into disability hiring, disability inclusion and retention from a perspective of, we don't want to be out of compliance with things. And it does make it a little bit challenging, I think, for folks that maybe are more focused on the social case or the economic case to be like, well, shouldn't you do the right thing because it's the right thing, not necessarily because we've set the bar at a certain location. But as I shared with you at the beginning, regardless of the position that you come to for bringing inclusion and diversity hiring into your organization, we maybe shouldn't spend as much time of unpacking that part of the why. It's the fact that you're actually moving forward. So for companies and organizations that have really used this sort of legal case or legal imperative for DEIA in the workplace are really making sure and focusing on those non-discrimination pieces, being aware that these are the laws and these are the standards either in our company, our city, our state, that we need to make sure that we're in compliance of. And they may or may not be leveraging different types of, government incentives or tax credits or things like that. I did want to point out here too, in terms around the legal case, I was doing a little bit more reading specifically about the CRPD in Taiwan. And some countries have really used the CRPD as sort of their legal imperative for inclusive hiring in their organizations as well. And again, I believe for Taiwan, and somebody should correct me if I am incorrect, that as a nation you ratified the CRPD in 2016. I think. So I hope that's correct. So the example that I brought 2 examples today of organizations who have made some changes and shifts because of a legal imperative or a discrimination case. So tech this tech organization is both based in the United States and in India. And this is all public information. So if you Googled them or you Googled legal cases of disability discrimination in the workforce, this is nothing secret. I did a screenshot here of a press release from last year. But they settled with the EEOC, which is the, Equal Employment Opportunities Commission in the United States. And they paid a fine because they had an individual who had applied for a job, needed an accommodation during the hiring process, which they did not provide. Long legal case. The settlement was $255,000. But if you look at their website today, you can clearly see the sort of before and after this particular case. They have sort of gone above and beyond in their onboarding process and talking to applicants online about how and why you should apply for a job with their organization. So again, is that the right way to go about disability inclusion and recruitment and hiring? I'm not going to say that it's good or bad, but this is one of the motivating factors that this organization used. Now, I will point out, and I have a slide a little bit later about this, because I think our countries and our organizations are very different in this way, is that if you are a multi-million-dollar organization, is $255,000 going to be a big deal to you? So one of the big challenges we've had in the United States is to say, if we're trying to support organizations, if we're trying to build policy that actually incentivizes DEIA in our work, these kinds of fines and slaps on the wrists are not going to probably do it. Again, I'll own that as my opinion, but you'll also see that here. So the other example that I wanted to bring about thinking about a legal imperative, and people could argue that this may or may not be the best example. So many folks have heard of Walmart. Within the top 3 or top 5 employers in the United States in terms of the numbers. And I put a lovely quote that they had from their chief people officer up there. But if you read about some of the legal cases that Walmart has been involved around in disability discrimination, it is everything from not allowing people to have job coaches to not accommodating physical needs of individual workers to not giving people the ability to use their assistive devices in the workplace. And so there's sort of case after case after case of times that Walmart has been fined by the EEOC or other entities. Yet, if you look at their website and look at some of the shifts that they've made over the years, they have improved in different ways. And so, again, I don't know the executives at Walmart personally and have not personally spoken to them, but it's an interesting example to sort of think about, why do we make those changes? What is that why in our company to sort of do the inclusive thing? I won't even say do the right thing, do the inclusive thing. But in some of the cases that I pulled up in thinking about Walmart, again, thinking about Walmart as one of the largest employers in the United States, some of the fines that they had were $300,000, $70,000, $125,000. And so again, it's kind of this sad rub of, we say that we want these things, we put policies in place to make them happen, but then when people break the rules, there's not necessarily the consequences of that. I was fascinated yesterday when one of our speakers talked about publishing a list of companies who did not comply with the diversity goals and diversity hiring. And I thought that that was fascinating, but a very unique cultural difference potentially between countries and nations about what motivates us, what is our why for leaning into diverse hiring and diversification of our workforce. So here was my other follow-up comment on compliance and fines. And again, I was very struck about maybe the cultural differences that our countries really think about, or what sort of drives those things, is that if you look at sort of the academic literature in the United States about interviewing companies doing surveys, talking to companies about, why do they, what motivates them to do or invest in more inclusive practices, really what we've learned, at least in the US, is that it's not a huge motivating, the fines and the lack of compliance is not a huge motivating factor. It's not one of the big things that sort of drives organizations to lean into DEIA practices. And I think it's just also really important to recommend or to think about is that compliance really represents just that minimum standard. And for many organizations, the two examples, the tech company and Walmart that I shared with you, is that the cost benefit really favors just paying the fee or paying the fine. And so I think, again, if you work in policy and things like that, to really be thinking about what sort of drives how we build those penalties or consequences, and that are they done in a meaningful way that actually could potentially change things, or are they just more of a performative act? One example that I will also just share about that is early in my career, I worked as a job coach. So I worked with disabled adults in community settings, and we worked in different businesses around the community that I lived in. And we had 2 interns from Austria one summer. And I was so fascinated to be like, oh, they were job coaches in Austria. And one of the things that they were really fascinated by was, how many different types of businesses hired workers with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But they described to us how in Austria at that particular time, and it was a number of years ago, how companies just chose to pay the fines. And again, when Dr. Annika was speaking yesterday, she was talking about the different models or approaches that EU countries use. And that really reminded me of the story about the 2 Austrian job coaches that came to work with us during the summer, of that some companies or some countries are just like, I'll pay the fine. It's not that big of a deal. So for those of us that are working in that policy space, how do we build the right kinds of pressure points and push points? Now, when I've talked about this in the past and thinking about what is the why, what is the driving force behind us as individuals, as well as what is the driving force for pursuing and investing in DEIA in our companies, I actually think there's a 4th one. Now, has been limited evidence in the literature about that. This is more really only sort of an anecdotal observation that myself and some of my colleagues have made. And that is, and this was the best term I could come up with, is the just because. So yesterday, Dr. Suzanne was talking about some of the laws and policies in the United States, and the Americans with Disabilities Act has really been a transformative piece of legislation in the US that has changed many different things for both workers, for companies, for schools, and really impacted American life in many positive ways. So what that has also meant, in addition to having the ADA, we've had inclusive schools. And we are seeing now more and more business owners, HR professionals, company leaders who have grown up in a space where disability is just, it's not even a factor. It's that, of course, disabled people are in my job. Of course, disabled people are riding the bus. Of course, disabled people are living in my apartment building. Of course, disabled people are shopping at my store. And when we've interviewed them and talked to them, and you sort of ask them, like, what is your why as a company? And they're just like, there is no why. It's just what we do. And it's a language shift. It's not that social case. It's this inclusion has been so folded into my thinking as a human and so folded into my experience as a human, it's just what we do. And so that actually gives me a little bit of goosebumps, because I think for those of us who have been doing inclusion work for a really long time, it's like, yes, that's what I think many of us hope that we get to, is that we just do it because it's what works and what makes sense. And the quote that I put down there from one of the companies that I had talked to, it says, I hired disabled people because it's just what I do. It's what I know, and why wouldn't I? Why not? So I think that's kind of an exciting shift that we might be seeing. And I think if you asked some of your colleagues or businesses that you work with, or even maybe yourself as an HR professional, as a company owner or executive, is your why just because? And the example that I wanted to bring about this, and I also think it kind of aligned with some of Dr. Suzanne's comments yesterday as well, was the importance of using media one of the groups that I had been a part of for many, many years, we started to try to tap into this idea of the just because reason for inclusive practices. And we started this media series on Facebook, of all places, called Why I Hire. And it were just these little snips of businesses talking about why do they hire workers with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And some people had really deep, philosophical cases about why they did it. We, of course, had to make it much shorter. But it's really kind of where we discovered this place of the just because case. And then also the power of using media to share your stories, to share your why, to share your practices. Because again, that sort of collective momentum is a pretty impactful thing. So as we move forward here is that a robust business strategy for your organization can really include all of these whys. It can include the social why, the economic why, the legal why. And at the end of the day, there are all sorts of reasons why people choose to lean into diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace. But if you're really thinking about your own journey, being able to identify that and convey that why to either your customers, to your staff, to your organization, really does add some deep value. And there is some evidence behind that. In the end of the slides here, I do have a link to this particular report, but it talks about companies and organizations in the United States that have increased their revenue, have increased their income, and have increased their profit because they have leaned into DEIA in the workplace. And I know yesterday, Director Sheila from Flow really talked about, she said how much benefit her organization had for all of these different reasons in leaning into DEIA. And I thought Flow was a great example of sort of they can track their progress over time. So one of the things that organizations often have asked about, well, how do we find our why? We might just go on with this sort of DEIA practices and inclusion because that's what the HR professional did before me, or that's what the CEO tells us we have to do. But why do we want to sort of dig into that a little bit more? And so engaging, and we heard this yesterday from a number of our speakers, engaging our senior leaders and executives is really critical, but it's also equally critical, and Dr. Kwan talked about this, about including and engaging your employees. So if you're really struggling to think about why do we do the things that we do and how do we transform that language into a narrative that really lifts up our employees, lifts up our efforts, and lifts up our business, there's a couple ways to think about that. So you might start with a why workshop. And again, if folks have questions about some of these activities, it's certainly something I can talk more about on an individual level. But the Simon Sinek video that I do link at the end is a great tool to use with executives, to use with your colleagues, to really dig into what is our why. You can have brainstorming sessions with your employees. You can have storytelling sessions where people are sharing their individual experiences. That was a beautiful experiences talking about the two professors today, the introvert and the extrovert, and the value of sharing those stories and sharing experiences. You might, as an organization, if you're in a place where you need to really focus on compliance or avoid fines, or you don't want to be on the published list in Taiwan of businesses that don't hire people with disabilities, you might gather a group of other finance, legal, and HR professionals in your company and dig in to sort of the pros and cons and the returns on investment on some of the strategies you might need to be using in as an organization to become more compliant or to lift up DEI differently. So there are a lot of different activities, and some of the activities in finding that why really sort of depend on who your organization is, what is most important and valuable to them, and what is the level of commitment of sort of engaging both your leadership as well as your employees in that conversation. So the next layer of this it's actually called the golden circle, of digging into that why is that how. What is the process? Because again, so many organizations and businesses come at these conversations of well, this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it, and never really spend any time on the why that they're doing it. But to be truly sustainable, you have to be able to dig into that why. So let's talk just for a few minutes about that how. So the how really represents both the internal and external processes that your business might undertake. And again, some of those internal things are, how do you engage employees? How do you make sure that your executives and your leaders are a part of those conversations? How do we identify shared priorities in that? And from a recruitment and hiring perspective, they can be things like, we need to update job descriptions. That's how we're going to do it. We need to use more accessible language in our job postings. That's how we're going to approach it. We want to outreach to a local vocational rehab provider to have partnerships to identify more disabled workers. That might be a way of how we do it. We might want to update our brand or tagline. So now that we know what our why is, maybe we want to think differently about our company and our organization's branding. So those are just a few examples of thinking about, once you know what your why is, then leaning into the how becomes a little bit easier. So for many companies that say and come to us and say, I want to be more inclusive, I want to hire disabled workers, we really try to push them back to that why first, because the how becomes so much easier when you understand what that why is. And again, I will say this over and over again, many of our speakers have talked about it already. We had many models of that from some of the leaders that were up on stage yesterday, is that you can't underestimate excuse me, the power of having senior leaders in your organization. And while I wish that it only just took one champion within a company to create all sorts of change, the reality is to make inclusion and belonging and inclusion and value in your work, you really have to have a team to do that. It can't be done by one person. And so there really is a role for that executive and that senior leader in the organization to really be leading the charge, both on how resources get allocated, how cultural tone and accountability are set. Those are really things that certain HR professionals certainly have a hand in, but can be made much easier when an executive or a senior leader is involved. And so what I did here was make a little bit of chart to say, well, HR and employee resource groups are absolutely and critically essential in thinking about doing the how. Having executive leadership really brings in that sort of authority level as well as investment level into the organization that can really take many of these initiatives and activities that we do to the next level. And at the end of the day is that for some of the companies and organizations we met on this journey, and we're going to hear from later today, by having your executive and your senior leaders talking and using the language of inclusion and the language of empowerment of disabled workers is some of the best selling points that you can also have to employees. Because if you have a great HR professional who's working in your organization, they're making job descriptions, they're hosting employee resource groups, they're bringing in speakers for people to be learning from, they're making all sorts of universal design decisions, that's great. But the heart and soul of organizations and the level of investment often comes from some of those senior leaders. And so making sure that you're engaging your most senior leaders in those conversations. So in kind of thinking a little bit more into this how, one of the things that we also talk about quite frequently with HR professionals are remembering these 5 A's. So access, awareness, advocacy, action, and accountability. So access, thinking about removing barriers to provide equal access to both employment opportunities, promotions, activities within the organization. I thought Flo's presentation was wonderful yesterday, and all the examples that they shared about how disabled workers were folded into every single aspect of the work, both the physical work, the emotional work, the social work that they were doing. In addition to access, it's really awareness, is that awareness is an incredibly important part of making a commitment to DEIA. If you don't talk about it, if you don't have a conversation about it, if you're not able to sort of bring people along, you're not engaging your employee base. You're not engaging some of the greatest strength that you have within your organization. The third A is advocacy, and so organizations being able to create an environment for individuals to feel comfortable disclosing their disabilities and forming networks that help amplify their voices to ensure their perspective is included. And that really goes into Dr. Kwan's presentation about how to create psychological safety. How do we create that genuine feeling and not that performative feeling? And so that comes along with advocacy. The fourth A is action, by integrating disability inclusion initiatives into this sort of umbrella, both under HR and leadership, that we're really ensuring that our DEA work is folded into all the types of work that we're doing. And then the last A is accountability, is that we have to be able to measure our progress. And that's really what I want to end on here today, is that if we haven't measured what we're doing, we'll never know if we got there or not. And that's not always necessarily the fun part. We can say that we're being inclusive. We can say that we want to hire disabled employees. But if we're not actually measuring some of the things that we're doing, then we don't necessarily have the evidence to show that it's been done. So, under the value of measurement, making sure that you're taking the time to not only identify goals within the HR space, but then measure the goals within the HR space. And so that can be providing proof of return on investment. When we have a central accommodation fund, this is how we're using it. When we're doing these and using this type of language, this is how we're mitigating our risk. When we're investing in these types of tools, this is how it's benefiting our employees or benefiting our customers. And so, again, this is in the slides that you can lean into. I'm not going to dig completely deeply in this, but making sure that you're thinking about measurement when it comes to recruitment and hiring, representation within your workforce, retention and progression. This was a really big one, and you heard about it from speakers yesterday, is that making sure that disabled workers are able to access wages, benefits, and promotions in the same way that all employees are able to. The equity of experience, there's all sorts of surveys that you can do as HR professionals to find out and dig in deeper to figure out if people and disabled workers are having their needs met. And then last but not least, making sure that we're offering training and professional development in key particular areas that we want to grow and see more of in our organization. So those are all sorts of low-hanging fruit, or maybe easier things that as an organization you can set up systems to monitor and track. And so now we're sort of here at our final station, and that is the what. What is our proof? What is our evidence? And when we have our evidence, we're then able to communicate more broadly to the outside world and to our customers about our commitment to inclusive hiring, recruitment, retention, and uplifting of disabled workers. And the measurement really matters, because if we're going to be able to say, here is what we did as an organization, here is who we are as a company, we now have evidence, we can show you how we did it, and we can talk about our why. And again, I would argue that starting with that why is really the core of building that central foundation to making sure that we're not, again, just engaging in performative practices, but that we're really, truly unpacking who we are as individuals, who we are as HR professionals, who we are as organizational leaders, will help us build a stronger cultural fabric that lasts well beyond any of us as individuals in our organization. So, in closing, I'm going to remember to click that here, true inclusion in the workforce and in the workplace moves past that legal minimum standard. Remember, we have some of those bars, but we set them low. We want to exceed those, because to embrace disabled workers in the most meaningful ways, that we can fully benefit from all of the gifts and the talents and the meaning that they bring to our organizations and our work, mean that we can add the social responsibility, our legal mandate, and all of the economic benefits that we have that result in actual, sustainable, tangible inclusion in our organizations. So, inclusion should always start with the why. And again, regardless of the journey that you are on as an HR professional, as an organization, whether you come at it from the social case, the economic case, the legal case, or even the just because case, that inclusion in the workplace always will come back to that why. So in my slides, you'll be able to find a couple of different references if you want to read some of the academic work, as well as some of the articles and the reports that I reference here. And again, I do highly recommend Simon Sinek's Start With Why TED Talk. It's an interesting way to get conversations started. Thank you so very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to spend the morning with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much